DevelopSec, developing security awareness with James Jardine, brought to you by Jardine Software. Hey everyone, James with the DevelopSec podcast here. Today I want to talk a little bit about the Equifax breach, not to voice my opinion on how they did, what they may have done right, what they may have done wrong, but I want to take some lessons out of what we know and try to see if we can talk about that in a way that'll help you within your organizations to make sure that you hopefully don't fall victim to the same thing. Every time we see these breaches on the news, there's always usually a different tactic that's used. And, we'll stay away from things like APT, right? But looking at things like Target, where they talk about it was HVAC vendors, that opened the doorway. You look at other breaches that occur and it's SQL injection, right? There's lots of ways that we see breaches happen, and I think we can always learn something from those within our organization. Take out the opinions, right, and just let's look at the facts, let's look at what we have, and let's talk about those topics and see how we can improve those processes within our organization. So obviously, the first thing I want to talk about is patching, because when we see everything, headlines and all, talking about the Equifax breach, right, they're talking about a missing struts patch as the way to get in, because that version had a vulnerability that would allow remote code execution that could then lead to access to the servers and potentially pulling all this data. Now, of course, we don't know how much data was actually pulled. A lot of times we like to err on the side of caution, and let's just list all of them up to 143 million records or whatever the number was. We don't necessarily know how much, but we have a good idea that that's probably the way that this occurred. So it's a great way to think about patching, because when we look at this one, if the way they got in is the way speculated, there was a patch for the vulnerability released a few months before the breach actually occurred. But you often think of patching, and you hear people all the time talk about, patching, it's easy, you just need a patch, right? You just need a patch. Everybody should patch. Patching is great. Patching is a necessity, all right? We need to do it, but we do have to remember that patching is just one of the controls that we put in place to help mitigate the risks to our organization. It's not the end-all, be-all. We want to be able to get them in there, but just like every other control that we may implement, we don't want to rely just on that control. We want to have other controls in place to think about that. And we'll talk about some of the other controls lightly throughout this podcast. But we shouldn't just be relying on patching. Like, patching shouldn't be the reason that you're breached, right? I mean, yeah, it's easy to point at it. Hey, that right there, you missed a patch. But usually that's more of a symptom. That's a sign that, okay, we missed something, but why did we not have other controls in place? Let's open up that discussion a little bit. But I want to talk about patching because it seems so simple. You just apply the patch. But in reality, it's really much more complex than that, right? It's not as simple as just applying the patch, right? We have different types of patches that we see. We have OS patches. You've got regular software patches, you've got component patches, all the way down to when you look at an application, even client-side code like jQuery or Bootstrap or Angular, right? These all require patches as well, right? I mean, vulnerabilities can be in any software that you use. So you have to have the ability to patch that software. Now, of course, it gets even more confusing or difficult, maybe complex, is when you start talking about software that has many components, and the component in the software needs patching. Now you're talking about hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of lines of code within your application, and then you've got these components, and this one component has to be updated. Well, do I have other components that depend on that component? If I update that one component, what does that actually do to my application? Did they just fix code that's encapsulated, or did something else change? And when I update to that new library, my code is actually going to stop working properly because they changed how an interface was. or something related to that where a call has now changed and my application breaks and now I have to modify the custom code. That makes things much more difficult to then apply these patches, because it's not just just grab the patch and install it, right? Because we don't want our application going down. Our business relies on our applications to be able to generate that revenue that helps keep our organization going. And of course, we have to weigh that with, hey, okay, we've got a severe vulnerability here. This could be an issue. What's the cost trade-off here of getting this worked out? So we can't just say that patching is just quick and easy and it's done with no problem. We can automate the whole problem, right? We can't necessarily just automate it. OS patches maybe a little bit more, but there's a lot more known about doing OS patching, right? We've got lots of tools that help us do this. So that may be somewhat a little easier, but we still have to test those. We still have to make sure that when we install that patch, it's not going to break our applications, it's not going to break the server, it's not going to cause ill effects after that patch has been put in place. Same thing goes for the software side. Now, another thing that we have to consider when we think about these patches is who's going to apply them. All right, we typically know OS patches are probably going to be done by the network team or the system administrators. They handle that. As a developer, I'm not going to do OS patching on a box, right? We have administrators that do that. But when you start getting down to the far other side, and you talk about like JavaScript libraries, well, from that side, that is the development doing the patching, right? Because that's going with the deployment package. It's saying, we had to update Bootstrap, boom, we fix it all in our stuff, and we pass it up through, right? Administrators really don't know anything about the client-side packages that you're setting up with there because they don't require installing. They're just part of the application. And then you got things like struts and you've got other stuff like that kind of sits in the middle ground. And I could see how it would be easy for, I thought you were doing it. No, I thought you were doing that. So it's important that we make sure that those type of processes and those responsibilities are very clear and outlined within the organization to make sure we know who's going to be handling those. We probably also have policies in place around patching. Hey, how long should it take? What needs to be patched? All these things go into the decision-making process to make sure that this stuff gets done, right? So we want to keep that in mind as well. But I don't want you to write off patching as, it's just a go-to, it should be easy, everybody should patch, we can never miss a patch in our life. There's been instances I've seen before where companies have been breached in a similar type of scenario where they were using a CMS that had an update come out, but unfortunately the amount of custom coding they had, they weren't able to just update to the latest greatest CMS, right? They had to actually do a whole bunch of changes to their code to be able to support that new version to then release it out in production. And unfortunately, same type of situation. They didn't get that new version out in time. They were sitting out there vulnerable, and they ended up getting hacked, right? And they suffered a breach. Now, was it the right decision to keep going and leave it out there while you're working on the fix versus trying to implement some sort of other thing in place that might mitigate this? I don't know. That's not my business, right? That's their business. And hopefully they were able to analyze the different trade-offs there. And within an organization, when we get these patches, that's something we have to think about. Just like all vulnerabilities or all security risks that we have to understand what that impact means to our business. And so we have to really take that analysis into consideration. And this is something that I push for when I talk about application security teams, and as you know, I talk about it all the time. I'm a big fan of getting a lot of application security into the development side because that's where it belongs, right? But then if you've got people that are application security analysts, right? We should be analyzing. So I often ask, or I think about, especially when I look at this Equifax breach, and we say, we had a missing struts patch. We knew about it for a couple months. It didn't get patched in time. Okay, but what was causing that? Maybe there were technical controls, but what information is passed around so that we understand the criticality of potential issues that come through, because not all patches are created equally, as with not all applications are created equally. So when you get something in and you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, I've got a patch, and let's use this as an example. I've got struts. It's a critical vulnerability. They say it leads to remote code execution. Okay, I mean that's pretty critical, even without having any context. But what if we start throwing context around that? Because then it starts to really make us understand, as business is all about taking risks and mitigating those risks and managing those risks, I'm going to start looking at it and say, okay, well, what application is running on that server, right? Because so we know we've got remote code execution on the web server sitting out there in Apache. Okay, but what is on that server? Is it an application that just serves up our corporate web page? There's no inputs. There's nothing. It's kind of just a box with a marketing site on it. Or do we have a site where, hey, this is a major portion of our business that exposes or has access to data to hundreds of millions of records of sensitive information and can allow this? So you look at the two and you think, wow, this is pretty serious over here with, sensitive information, millions of records. And then you say, well, it's serious over here, but it's a marketing site. And I'm not advocating not to fix marketing sites. But the point is that you have to be able to look at it from that perspective. Because then when you start looking at it that way, then you can start bringing that up and saying, hey, look, here's the reason why we need to get this done. This is why this is a priority. It affects this information within our application for this number of users, and it's pretty easy. There's already exploits out there. This needs to be dealt with ASAP versus, yep, it's out there on that server. There's one app on that server. It's not connected to the domain. It's, XYZ. Here's what we got. Can we go another day? What's going to happen if this got owned versus if that got owned? How does it affect the business? And we need to start kind of thinking about that a lot more when we talk about vulnerabilities. Is what's the risk management there? What actually do we have from an analysis standpoint of what this means for us? So that's for patching. Make sure you have, good patching process in place. Document this stuff so you know who's responsible and what your expectations are for getting these patches in. What's the process for testing them and getting them pushed out to be able to show that you're following those processes. Now, another thing that I heard people talk about was encryption. Oh, the data all should have been encrypted. Okay, well, that's easy to say too, but what does that mean? Are you talking about disk encryption? Are you talking about column level encryption? What encryption are you talking? Are you talking about both? Do I have to encrypt everything and then encrypt that because I guess my encrypted stuff needs to be encrypted? We have to be smart about this when we talk about encrypting data, and understand that there's different ways that we can do it, and those have their pros and cons. Maybe you're going to say, hey, we use disk encryption for our databases. Okay, well, great. You got disk encryption on it. If I were to be able to somehow get that database, the file, and snatch it over to my system, it's encrypted. I can't get access to it. Okay, and maybe through the struts vulnerability, that's how they're able to pull data. I don't have those details. It doesn't really matter, right? What matters is we talk about the idea of encryption and how we can protect our own systems. So maybe I put disk encryption on there and I can't steal it that way. But my application, through SQL injection or some other flaw, allows me access to that data because, of course, it's decrypted once it's put in so I can actually use it with my application. Well, we could go column level encryption, but we still have some of those risks if it's still an app flaw. So we don't want to jump straight to conclusions here on, hey, the data should have been encrypted. Data encryption is good, but we also have to understand the effect it may have on usability, the ability to search, performance, right? There's all kinds of things that encryption can cause a problem with. Never mind the fact that if you lose your encryption keys, you denial a service yourself, and now you no longer have access to the data. This can be not good as well, so something we need to consider. So try to stay away from just the idea of, we should throw encryption out there. And I'll give you an example of why this isn't always the answer. But it is part of the layers of defense, as I started out saying, right? Patching isn't the only control. Encryption is another control that we can put in place if we're using it right, but we have to understand it to use it right. And I worked for an organization where we had an issue, and it wasn't encryption in the database that was a problem. It was encryption outside, actually on the URL, where they had cross-site scripting as a flaw. And it was reflective. It was on the URL. You could manipulate the data, send the link to somebody, and sure enough, it would execute cross-site scripting. So the initial response was, well, we'll encrypt the data in the URL, which great. I can't manipulate the data in the URL anymore. That's good. I mean, that solved the problem from that perspective. Unfortunately, we didn't do a lot of analysis around it when they decided that against my recommendation. They did it and then found out that, wait a minute, we've got another form that allows us to set that data. So ultimately what we did was we encrypted the payload for an attacker so nothing would pick up that payload for us. So that was actually a bigger problem than what we had originally. And we had an issue where the page needed to use that data and it was encrypted. So then how do you decrypt it for the page to use it? It ended up turning into a really big debacle where we ended up saying, okay, enough with the encryption. Let's just go ahead and do the output encoding like we should have in the first place. But it's a good example of encryption isn't always the answer. It may be a portion of the answer in the right spot. And in our databases, we do want to encrypt certain data, right? That's sensitive data. When you think of social security numbers, when you think of other personal identifying sensitive data, maybe we want to encrypt that. We want to protect that data. But you have to go back and look and see how you want to do that within your organization. And each organization should have data classification policies, and those data classification policies should identify what is the classification for each type of data that your application has, and then what should you be doing to protect that. Just because you say that social security number is highly sensitive doesn't mean that you're going to do anything different with it if there's nothing in there specifying, hey, highly sensitive information needs to be encrypted this way, whether it's, hey, we use disk encryption on the database, whether we use column level encryption on the database, whether we use both, whether we're throwing tokenization in there, whatever it may be. We want to go back into our organizations and look and say, hey, let's talk about the data classification policy. Let's go in and look at that and let's see what are we doing as an organization? What's our requirement for protecting certain data? And let's make sure we're doing that, right? So it's another chance for us to go in and make sure that we're doing the stuff that we think we're doing. Because a lot of times we just assume that we're doing it, and it's not specifically stated someplace. And then we find out, oh, yeah, we weren't doing that. We use these opportunities to go back and verify that we are doing what it is we think we're doing. Another piece that I want to talk about is auditing and logging. Because when something does happen, we hopefully want to be able to see that it did. We want to be able to track what happened as it went through. So is your application doing auditing and logging? And I talk about this before, right? I mean, oftentimes when I see developers putting logging into their applications, it's for troubleshooting purposes, right? I want to see the stack trace that happened. I want to see the errors that occurred. It's that. But when we talk about a security perspective, we're also talking about failed logins. We're talking about all kinds of different things. Successful logins, not just failed. Changes to accounts. If you have sensitive data, when that data is viewed. So if you've got things with social security numbers, logging when people and who those people are that viewed that data, right? That all comes in to help us identify either an attack happening or after the fact, what happened during that attack. The thing, though, that I want to point out, especially when you think about the Equifax breach, is that this was through struts. And I don't have all the details on how the struts vulnerability works. I think there are some details out there that talk about it. But if this is something that kind of goes around your app, right? Oh, hey, this is in struts. It's not in your custom code base. Well, your logging might not be catching that. So then the question is, okay, well, is it logging outside of that? Are we looking at the OS event logs that we need to see that would pick this up? When you have these different components, logging spans so much, right? It goes from the operating system all the way to our custom code. And we talk about trying to use central sources for log management, right? Put it in your SIM, send all the logs to this one place, and somebody will look at them and they'll correlate them and they'll figure everything out going with it. But that's something we need to get better at, because oftentimes our app logs aren't going up there. And maybe we're sitting there looking at our app logs and we don't see anything in the app log because this one actually went to an event log for the OS. Well, are the OS guys looking at that? Maybe the OS guys saw something, but they couldn't correlate it to an application. So these things cover a broad spectrum, and we have to have that cross communication going on. It's not just our app, right? I mean, we like to look at it as, hey, we're the development team, and we develop these apps, and we're kind of in a vacuum. And here's the network team over there, and they build the servers for us, and they're in their vacuum. But remember that all that stuff works together, and it interconnects, and we have to be able to see all that stuff together. So take a moment to go back and look at the type of logs that you're doing, see, what you're capturing, how you're auditing what's captured. Think about who is auditing those, right? I mean, do you have any policies or procedures in place that talk about who goes in and looks at these logs, when they go in and look at these logs? All that stuff should be considered so that way you know what's going on when you get ready to handle your application from a security perspective. We all know how to go in and do the development. We can write the code. We can make it do cool stuff. But we also have to be able to make sure that somebody's not doing cooler stuff with our application, to help protect us. So that's something I think is a big thing to think about, is that logging and auditing. And, that auditing is then going in and looking at those logs to see what's going on. So I just want to provide kind of those 3 kind of things to think about when you're thinking about the Equifax breach. Push away, all the opinions that you're seeing, the Monday morning quarterbacking that's going on. All right, that stuff doesn't really matter. All right, that's just a lot of hype that's sitting out there, that really just kind of clutters everything. Peel that stuff away. Any articles you're looking at, try to peel it away and look for the details, look for the facts. If there was a patch missing, right, then, okay, take that information and say, hey, how can I apply that to my environment? Do we have patches that are out of place? Do we have patches that we have not applied yet that are critical? And go back and review those patches. Review your patch process. Make sure you have one. And you have clearly defined who's responsible for doing it. What are the processes for making it happen? Go in and look at this stuff. That's what we can take away from when we see these different news stories is, what are other people doing? What are they seeing? Think of it as kind of our threat intelligence network. Is, what are other people seeing? Oh man, somebody got hit because that component was vulnerable and somebody exploited that, and look what they did there. Hey, wait, we use that component, right? Go back to our asset inventory. We use that component. Where is it used? Man, we better make sure that we've got this solved up. We've got it patched. We're protected. But then take it that next step. Okay, I've got patches in place, but what's the next step past that? What happens if my patch isn't there? Do I have some sort of WAF in front that could help protect in the short term? Am I running something that would do that? Do I have encryption in place that if they were to come through this attack method, they're only going to get encrypted data, which we don't want them to get encrypted, but at least it's encrypted? Versus if they go this other way, start thinking down through some of those things. It's actually kind of a fun process to go through it. And being developers and QA testers and that right, we like the curiosity. I mean, we like trying to figure things out and think things through. It's just looking at it a little bit different way. So think about that. Make sure you understand your pieces, and hopefully you can use some of the things that happen with other systems to your advantage and use that as kind of the Kickstarter to starting off maybe an internal verification of the controls you have in place. So hopefully everybody is doing well. I appreciate everybody that listens. And, as always, if you have questions or any feedback, please feel free to send them over. You just send it to james@developsec.com, or you can find us on Twitter @developsec, or you can reach me out at Jardine Software as well on Twitter. But really appreciate everybody listening. Again, we do have the YouTube channel up now, which for now just has the podcast, and I'm replaying. I'm converting all the old podcasts up so that way we've got those in case you want to start re-listening to some of the old versions or old episodes that we had out there. But I've got some other stuff that I want to start putting together as well to put up there, to help provide some of this awareness and training and help people out regarding application security. So I appreciate everybody listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
You have been listening to the DevelopSec podcast with James Jardine. Follow us on Twitter at DevelopSec and visit our website at www.developsec.com for more episodes and information.